My name is Chris Merrill. I'm a professor at Illinois State University in the Department of Technology. Today, we're going to talk about how to make epoxy tables through the 5E learning process. Stage of the 5E learning process is engage. So here we're trying to engage our students with the content that we are trying to teach. So in order to engage you, I'm going to show you 4 pictures of epoxy tables that I found on Pinterest. Now, when you look through these, if you're anything like me, I get real excited about what I'm seeing in these pictures, which is then followed up by my final project of this presentation where I created an epoxy coffee table. The stage of the 5E learning process is titled Explore. So in the Explore section, you want your students to explore the content on their own by creating some type of activity that relates to the content. When I started learning how to do epoxy tables, I found some live edge lumber and created a river table by coloring epoxy, putting some rocks in, and kind of experimenting with how that works, how to build the form, how to put the epoxy in, what's the right consistency, and so on, which was then followed up by another explore topic, and that was creating a sign for some friends of mine that provided me some lumber to use. So in the explore section, you're going to have to come up with some type of activity for your students to explore how to use epoxy. The third stage of the 5E learning process, we want to turn to the explain section. So here's the opportunity for the students to explain what they've learned so far during the engagement section and during the exploration section. So in regard to the epoxy tables, students should start explaining how volume was calculated, how volume was converted to either grams or ounces, how the epoxy was mixed, and so on. So in that explain section, that's where you as that teacher really need to be checking for understanding and then making sure that if there's any misconceptions that they're corrected. Fourth stage of the 5E learning process is labeled elaborate and extend. So in this stage, this is where the students are applying what they've learned to a real life situation. And in this case, making an epoxy table or making something from wood and using epoxy. So that brings us to the fifth E of the 5E learning process, and this one's evaluate. So in the evaluate section, this is where the students are creating their project and you are going to evaluate them. So let me walk you through what I did to make the cherry coffee table. First, I started in AutoCAD and created the shape that I wanted. The second thing I did was take the geometry and put it into Inventor so I could calculate my volume so I could order enough epoxy. The next part, as you can see in the pictures, I labeled or I drew out where my S or my simulated S would be, so I knew where to cut, or actually, let me back up. So I knew where to place my biscuits when I glued up all my stock. So in my finished piece, I wouldn't run into a biscuit and then have that visible to the eye. So after that was over, because I wanted this thing to be exact, I drew this up and put it into the ShopBot format. and then shot botted the S out so I could get two symmetrical pieces to my coffee table. So as you can see by the pictures that were in here and the videos, um, I'm just trying to demonstrate and show the shot bot process. Now that you've seen the shape cut out with the shot bot, let's turn our attention to the next step. So to create a simulated edge of of live edge wood, I took a chamfer bit and then just chamfered both of the inside edges of the cherry. Once that was done, I built a form, put a shop um, cloth, a plastic tarp rather, between my form and the cherry wood, and then got that all set up. Put my rocks in, got those all set. Of course, I already calculated my epoxy, so I knew how much to mix, and simply started putting that in. And as you can see by the pictures, there are weights on the cherry, and that's simply to hold it down so it doesn't move and the epoxy doesn't get underneath of it. So after 72 hours of the epoxy curing, I was able to take the table out of the form and then had to do quite a bit of work to get it ready for prime time. I had to get some epoxy that had spilled off on the top, had kind of gotten underneath the edges on the backside, had to get all that cleaned up. So you'll have to spend some time doing some sanding. So after I got it sanded, I used a router with a roundover edge and routed the entire perimeter of the tabletop. And as you can see by the picture, the epoxy will hold an edge and it really looks attractive to the eye. So after sanding this thing up, and I sanded from all the way up through 320 grit. So it was pretty smooth, and obviously the epoxy was very clear. So after I sanded this thing up through 320 grit, I applied polyurethane, and I ended up putting 3 coats of polyurethane on this tabletop, and then of course sanded in between my coats. So the picture that you're seeing is the final coat of the polyurethane. So let's talk about some of the supplies that you're going to need to do an epoxy project. Number one, you're going to need a bunch of scrap wood to build your forms. So this is a good use of your scrap wood because honestly, after your forms are built, you're probably, and your project comes out, you're probably going to throw away your forms anyway. Second, of course, you're going to need some epoxy. So I listed the epoxy that I used here in the supplies used list. I for my river table and my cherry coffee table, I used rocks, and I was able to get washed rocks from Hobby Lobby. You're going to need rubber gloves. Uh, Epoxy gets everywhere when you're doing this, so make sure you have rubber gloves. Isopropyl alcohol, that is used on any edge that you're going to apply epoxy to. So before you put epoxy in, all your edges have to be wiped down with alcohol. The next step, make sure you have some clear mixing containers. I used several different graduated cylinders that I could simply use and then dispose of. And then finally, on this list here, there's a heat gun. So when you put the epoxy in your form, you're going to create air bubbles, which is normal and it's fine. So you take the heat gun and then you just simply place it over the top of your epoxy, and the heat will remove the air bubbles from your project. On my second slide of supplies used, you will find stirring sticks. And I use the stirring sticks for my real small epoxy job, like that sign that I showed you earlier in the presentation. If you're going to do uh, a larger project, you're definitely going to want a paint stirrer with a silicone head that you can put in the drill, because your silicone has to mix, depending on the manufacturer, anywhere from 5 minutes to 8 minutes. So you certainly want a drill to do that with. Plastic drop cloths, I explained earlier, I use that between the cherry and the form to help keep the epoxy from going everywhere. House wrap, on the first project that I showed you with the river edge, the form had a house wrap sheathing tape placed on the bottom of my form. And this is a really good product because the epoxy won't stick to it. And then you can separate your finished product from your form. I also used a gram scale, which you have to convert your volume from inches cubed into either grams or ounces. And that made measuring out my epoxy and then the activator or the hardener a lot easier. The river edge table also had some blue coloring in it. And so I used a powdered blue epoxy coloring system, and it created a real nice looking river. And then finally, I used some weights in some of the images. I also used clamps, and simply, it wasn't to clamp anything together. I used the clamp so I could put downward pressure on my stock. So now for the recommendations. As you can see on the screen, I have several recommendations. And of course, these are things that I learned by doing the epoxy for the first time. And the first one, I put level your mold. I can't overemphasize the fact that everything needs to be perfectly level. Uh, because if not, you will see your epoxy go to the low side pretty darn quick. The second one, build your form from exact measurements. Uh, and I suggest that simply because it helps you keep your stock square, helps you so your parts don't move, but then also be prepared to have to rip a joint or crosscut both ends because epoxy is going to leak out. Uh, Third bullet, epoxy acts like water. It's like water. It is super thin and it is going to flow and flow and flow because it does not cure, at least the epoxy that I used, until 72 hours later. So speaking of the 72 hours, you need to make sure that when you do your project, you know that, hey, it's going to be there for a few days. You don't want any dust because dust will settle in that epoxy. One of the things I found that I was kind of funny, not real funny, but about halfway through my cure, a fly decided to land in my epoxy. And of course, I didn't want a fly in the finished piece, and I ended up having to dig it out and then re-pour epoxy and then wait 72 more hours. So, be careful of the environment that you're going to leave your part in. The color that I used on the river table, I actually used 1 gram of blue, and that's how blue that table became. So when you are going to use a colored pigment, I would try to experiment and use very little and then keep adding until you get the color that you want. The final thing is epoxy is really expensive. So you need to make sure that you're calculating your volume correctly. You're not mixing any more that you need because once you mix it, you're stuck with it, right? So you're either going to use it or you're going to throw it away. What I did learn was start with a small project first. Learn how epoxy works, learn the cure, learn the mix, and then go from smaller to larger. So now that I have shown you the epoxy table, let's go back through the 5E learning process, which I think is extremely powerful, student-centered approach for your classroom. So engage is a first step. So I showed you pictures of epoxy tables, and hopefully that got you really engaged in the product. And, and you'll be able to do the same thing with your kids, whether it be pictures from the internet or projects that you've made. The second part is the explore section of the 5E learning process. So here, we want our students exploring about the content, whether they're doing research and development, whatever you determine to be the right exploration setup for your class. The third part is the explain section. So again, we're looking at how can students explain what they're learning. So that could be verbal, it could be written, it could be through even a smaller project, which would then kind of go into that extend and elaborate area. And then finally, the evaluate section, which would be the last one. So again, I use the finished coffee table as my evaluation of learning how to do epoxy tables. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I learned a great deal about how to do epoxy, some things that went well, some things that didn't go so well. But in the end, after watching this stuff on the internet or on Facebook, I wanted to try this, and I'm really excited about it, and can't wait till my next project. So, thank you for attending this session, and I hope you learned a lot and had some fun. Thanks.